A quick note. This story delves into themes of disappearance and psychological distress. Listener discretion is advised. Imagine a place where the trees don't just stand, they watch. Where the ground doesn't just absorb, it remembers. A place where the silence isn't empty, but heavy with unspoken truths. For generations, the locals whispered about Willow Creek Forest, a sprawling wilderness nestled deep in the Appalachian foothills. They called it the Breathing Woods. They said it had a pulse, a will of its own. Most dismissed it as folklore, campfire tales spun to spook tourists. But then people started vanishing. Not just casual hikers who wandered off the path, mind you. These were experienced outdoorsmen, hunters who knew every twisted route and hidden ravine like the back of their hand. They simply disappeared. No distress calls, no broken bones, no scattered gear. Just gone. The search parties would comb the area for weeks, finding nothing but the unsettling quiet of the forest itself. No tracks, no signs of struggle, not even a discarded granola bar wrapper. It was as if the earth had simply opened up and swallowed them whole. The last person to vanish was David Hayes. David was an embodiment of the wilderness. Lean, strong, with eyes that saw more in a forest than most people ever would. He'd spent his entire life exploring these mountains, guiding tours, mapping forgotten trails. If anyone could survive Willow Creek, it was David. Yet 6 months ago, he walked into those woods for a solo expedition, a new GPS unit clutched in his hand, and never returned. His sister, Emily, refused to accept it. Emily was a city girl, a graphic designer with a sharp wit and an even sharper sense of loyalty. She and David were inseparable growing up, despite their vastly different paths. When the local sheriff, Michael Chun, finally closed David's case, citing presumed death due to exposure, Emily felt a cold fury settle in her bones. Exposure? David Hayes? The man who could build a shelter out of pine needles and find water in a rock? It was an insult to his memory, and a lie she couldn't swallow. Emily packed her life into storage, bought a used SUV, and drove 3 states to the small, sleepy town bordering Willow Creek. She arrived with a single-minded purpose: find David, or at least find out what happened to him. The town was a picturesque postcard of rural America, but beneath its charming facade, Emily felt an undercurrent of unease. The locals were friendly enough, but their eyes held a weariness, a guardedness whenever Willow Creek was mentioned. Their smiles seemed to falter, their voices dropped to a near whisper. She started her own investigation, sifting through the meager police reports, interviewing anyone who would talk. The initial search had been thorough, involving helicopters, tracking dogs, and dozens of volunteers. They found David's truck parked neatly at the trailhead, his phone inside charged and waiting. His wallet, keys, everything he didn't need for a hike was left behind. It was as if he'd simply walked away from his life, leaving no trace of where he went or why. The only thing missing was David himself, and the brand new satellite-enabled GPS device he'd been so excited about. Emily spent weeks in the town library, poring over old newspaper archives. She found dozens of missing person reports stretching back decades, all linked to Willow Creek. Each story eerily similar. Experienced hikers, hunters, even a couple of young lovers who'd gone for a romantic stroll. All gone without a trace. The authorities always concluded the same thing: lost, exposure, animal attack, or simply left. But Emily noticed a pattern. No bodies. Not one. It was a statistical anomaly that screamed something far more sinister than bad luck. One rainy afternoon, huddled in the cramped local diner, Emily overheard a hushed conversation between 2 elderly men. Their words were fragments, but they painted a chilling picture. "The woods don't like to be watched," one rasped, stirring his coffee. "They don't like to be mapped." The other nodded gravely. "Especially not with them newfangled machines. It stirs them up." Emily felt a prickle of unease. Could the forest truly be alive? Resentful? The very idea was absurd. Yet it resonated with the unsettling pattern she'd uncovered. Driven by a desperate hope and a growing conviction that the forest held the key, Emily bought hiking gear, a compass, and a powerful 2-way radio. She studied topographic maps, meticulously charting every known trail, every dead end, every area that David had frequented. She knew the risks. Everyone in town had warned her. "That forest ain't right, missy," a kind old woman had told her, pressing a homemade charm into her hand. It got its own ways. The morning she decided to enter Willow Creek, the sky was an oppressive gray, mirroring the dread in her stomach. She parked her SUV next to David's old, dust-covered truck, a silent monument to his disappearance. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, but beneath it, Emily detected something else, a faint, almost metallic tang, like ozone mixed with something decaying. It was subtle but persistent. Stepping onto the trail, the forest immediately closed around her. The trees here were ancient, their branches interwoven so tightly that the sunlight struggled to penetrate, casting the path into perpetual twilight. The silence was profound, broken only by the crunch of her boots on fallen leaves and the distant, mournful cry of a hawk. But it wasn't a peaceful silence. It felt expectant, like the forest was holding its breath. She followed the main trail for an hour, scanning the undergrowth, calling David's name softly every few minutes, her voice swallowed by the vastness. There was nothing. No discarded water bottle, no broken branch, nothing to indicate he had even passed this way. It was too clean, too perfect. David was meticulous, but even he would leave some small trace. Then she veered off onto a less used path, one David had marked on an old map, a shortcut to a secluded waterfall he loved. The air grew heavier here, the light dimmer. The trees seemed to press in closer, their gnarled trunks like ancient, watchful sentinels. She noticed something strange about the ground. It wasn't firm earth. It was soft, almost spongy beneath her feet, a sensation that grew more pronounced with every step. It felt organic, like walking on a giant moss-covered sponge that slowly yielded to her weight, then subtly pushed back. A low, resonant hum began to fill the air, barely perceptible at first, like a distant generator, but growing steadily. It wasn't mechanical. It was deep, guttural, vibrating through the soles of her boots. It felt less like a sound and more like a pervasive pressure, a vibration in her very bones. The trees around her seemed to shimmer, their leaves rustling even though there was no breeze. This was it. This was the breathing the locals spoke of. Panic began to coil in Emily's gut, cold and sharp. This wasn't just a forest. This was something else entirely. She gripped her radio, her thumb hovering over the call button, but her rational mind fought back. She was here for David. She couldn't turn back now. She pushed deeper, following the path marked on David's map. The humming intensified, a living thrum that seemed to emanate from the very ground beneath her. She felt a strange dizziness, a slight disorientation. The trees around her began to look less like individual organisms and more like interconnected veins, part of a single colossal entity. Suddenly, she stopped dead in her tracks. Ahead, nestled between two towering oaks, was a patch of ground unlike anything she had ever seen. It was a perfect circle about 10 feet in diameter, covered in a peculiar luminescent moss that pulsed with a faint greenish glow. And in the very center of that glowing circle, half buried in the moss, lay David's brand new GPS unit. Not broken, not damaged, but almost fused with the strange growth, as if it had been absorbed, slowly digested by the forest itself. Emily's heart hammered against her ribs. She took a step closer, her breath catching in her throat. The GPS screen was blank, but as she reached out a trembling hand, the moss around it seemed to retract slightly, revealing the device more clearly. And then as she watched, horrified, a single glowing symbol flickered to life on its screen. It wasn't a map or coordinates. It was an icon she didn't recognize, but one that filled her with an overwhelming sense of dread. It looked like a single wide-open eye. An eye staring back at her. An eye staring back at her. Sarah's breath hitched, a cold knot tightening in her stomach. The screen, vibrant just moments ago, now pulsed with an unnatural, sickly yellow light, illuminating the ancient, gnarled roots that snaked across the forest floor around her. Her phone, her lifeline, had transformed into something alien, something that mocked her desperate need for direction. The symbol, stark and unsettling, seemed to dilate, an iris expanding, contracting as if observing her. She stared at it, frozen, the blood draining from her face. This wasn't a glitch. This wasn't a low battery warning. This was deliberate. Her fingers, trembling, instinctively tightened around the device. She tried to swipe, to tap, to close the app, to do anything to banish the horrifying image, but the screen was unresponsive. It remained fixed, the glowing eye burning into her retina, reflecting the deepening shadows of the encroaching dusk. A wave of irrational fear, cold and sharp, pierced through her. It felt as though whatever intelligence was behind that symbol was now directly connected to her, seeing through her eyes, knowing her every thought. Panic began to claw at her throat. She squeezed her own eyes shut, taking a ragged, shuddering breath, trying to dispel the image, to convince herself it was merely a trick of the light, a hallucination brought on by exhaustion and dehydration. When she opened them again, the eye was still there, unwavering. With a choked gasp, she hurled the phone away from her, sending it skittering across the damp earth, its unnatural glow briefly illuminating a patch of ferns before it tumbled into a shallow cavity between two roots and vanished from sight. The sudden silence that followed was deafening, a stark contrast to the frantic beat of her own heart pounding in her ears. For a moment, she felt a fleeting sense of relief, as if she had severed a connection to something malevolent. But the relief was short-lived, replaced by a fresh wave of terror. She was now truly, utterly alone, deeper than ever in a forest that felt increasingly hostile, with no means of communication, no map, and no light source beyond the fading twilight. The air around her seemed to grow heavy, thick with the scent of damp earth and something else. Something metallic, like ozone before a storm, but without the promise of rain. The usual symphony of the forest, the chirping of crickets, the rustling of unseen creatures had fallen silent. It was as if every living thing had collectively held its breath, waiting for her. She tried to retrace her steps, her mind a whirlwind of fear and confusion. Left at the fallen log, then past the split oak, but the fallen log wasn't there. Or if it was, it looked different, swallowed by an indistinguishable thicket of undergrowth. Every tree seemed to morph into the next, their ancient, moss-covered trunks blurring into an endless repeating pattern. The path she thought she had been following, the faint deer trail that had given her a semblance of direction, had vanished entirely. It was as if the forest itself was actively erasing her tracks, closing in around her, making escape impossible. Her boots sank into the softer earth, each step heavy and deliberate, a desperate attempt to find purchase, to orient herself. The canopy above, once a comforting green dome, now felt like a suffocating lid, pressing down on her. The light, which should have been fading into a gentle twilight, was instead taking on an eerie, almost purple hue, making the shadows stretch and dance with unsettling life. Every branch, every twisted vine seemed to reach out, forming grotesque, fleeting shapes in her peripheral vision. A gnarled hand, a hunched figure, an unblinking eye. She shook her head violently, trying to clear the terrifying images from her mind. It was just her imagination, she told herself, fueled by fear and exhaustion. But then she heard it. A sound, faint at first, barely perceptible beneath the frantic rhythm of her own breathing. It wasn't the wind. It was a low, resonant thrum, a deep vibration that seemed to emanate from beneath the very ground she stood on. It was subtle, like the distant rumble of machinery, but it was organic, alive, and it was getting closer. Sarah stopped dead, her muscles tensing, every nerve ending screaming in alarm. She pressed her ear to one of the giant root-bound trees, desperate to pinpoint the source. The thrum intensified, vibrating through the rough bark, through her very bones. It felt like a heartbeat, slow and powerful, pulsing deep within the earth. Thump-thump, thump-thump. It wasn't just a sound, it was a sensation. The ground beneath her feet began to subtly shift, a gentle undulation, as if the forest floor itself was inhaling and exhaling. She stumbled, catching herself on a nearby trunk, her fingers digging into the cold, damp wood. The trees around her seemed to sway, not with the grace of wind, but with a heavy, deliberate movement, their branches creaking like ancient bones. The leaves, instead of rustling, seemed to whisper, a dry, papery murmur that coalesced into an almost audible, wordless chant. "No," she whimpered, her voice barely a breath. "This isn't real." But it was real. The air grew colder, heavy with that metallic, ozonic scent, and a thick, swirling mist began to rise from the forest floor, clinging to her ankles, then her knees, obscuring her vision further. The mist wasn't white or gray. It was a faint, phosphorescent green, pulsing faintly in sync with the rhythmic thrumming of the earth. Sarah's mind, usually so sharp and logical, began to unravel. She was lost, alone, and the forest, this seemingly benevolent natural sanctuary, was transforming into something monstrous, something alive and aware, breathing around her. She remembered the old local legends, the hushed tales of the breathing woods, stories she had dismissed as quaint folklore. Now they clawed at her, demanding belief. She had to get out. She had to run. Turning blindly, she plunged deeper into the swirling green mist, her legs pumping, her lungs burning. The thrumming intensified, becoming a pervasive pressure against her eardrums, echoing the frantic beat of her own heart. The ground continued its slow, deliberate undulation, making her footing precarious. She stumbled over hidden roots, scraped her hands on unseen thorns, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. The whispers in the leaves grew louder, closer, intertwining with the deep, resonating hum. It wasn't just the sound of leaves anymore. It was a chorus of faint, disembodied voices, murmuring just beyond the edge of her hearing. Their words indistinct, yet laden with an ancient, chilling sorrow. Were they calling to her? Warning her? Or were they simply the echoes of others who had been swallowed by this living forest? Suddenly, the mist ahead of her began to coalesce, drawing together like strands of smoke, forming a swirling vortex of glowing green light. It pulsed, expanded, and contracted, mirroring the rhythm of the breathing earth. Her frantic run faltered, her feet dragging to a halt. The vortex was growing, solidifying, its center darkening into an impenetrable void. And then, in the heart of that swirling green light, the symbol reappeared. Not on a phone screen, but hanging in the air itself, vast and imposing, etched in pure luminous energy. The wide-open eye, now impossibly large, stared directly at her, its gaze piercing through the mist, through her fear, through her very soul. It wasn't just a symbol anymore. It was a gateway, a living, breathing aperture into something unimaginable. The thrumming reached a crescendo, shaking the ground violently, sending a jolt through her entire body. The whispers in the leaves became a roar, a gale of sound that tore through the air, ripping at her sanity. The metallic scent intensified, burning her nostrils. She felt an irresistible pull, a strange magnetic force drawing her towards the glowing eye, towards the void. Her legs, heavy with exhaustion and dread, began to move independently of her will, taking one slow, deliberate step after another towards the swirling green portal. Her mind screamed in protest, but her body was no longer her own. She was being drawn in like a moth to a monstrous ancient flame. The forest was breathing, and with every breath, it pulled her deeper into its living, pulsating heart. The eye widened, beckoning, promising either revelation or oblivion, and Sarah, powerless, felt herself being drawn into its terrifying, radiant depths. The world dissolved into a maelstrom of light and sensation, not darkness but in blinding, overwhelming radiance that pulsed with a rhythm alien yet profound. Sarah felt herself stretched, pulled apart, her very atoms seeming to vibrate in unison with the forest's colossal heartbeat. It wasn't a physical entry into a space, but an immersion into an ocean of pure consciousness, a torrent of ancient memories and raw, untamed life. Colors she had never seen before exploded around her, hues that burned with the intensity of a dying star, and others that shimmered with the cool luminescence of deep-sea creatures. Sounds, not of rustling leaves or snapping twigs, but of geological shifts, of roots burrowing through millennia-old earth, of sap rising in colossal, unseen trees, all blended into a deafening symphony that roared within her skull. She felt the texture of bark that had weathered epochs, the chill of subterranean springs, the warmth of sunlight filtered through canopies that predated humanity. Then the chaos began to coalesce, forming fleeting, nightmarish visions. Not clear pictures but impressions, fragments of moments ripped from time and flung into her awareness. She saw faces, human faces, contorted in fear, awe, or despair, appearing and disappearing faster than her mind could process. They were indistinct, ghostly, but their emotions were starkly real, echoing within her own chest. She saw glints of metal, primitive tools, then modern ones, all swallowed by the encroaching green. She glimpsed structures, crude shelters, then crumbling stone, then nothing but the relentless, consuming forest. A profound, guttural groan reverberated through her, a sound that wasn't heard with her ears but felt in her bones, a lamentation of immense age and sorrow, laced with an unsettling hunger. It was the forest itself breathing out its pain, its endless, patient waiting. And within that groan, a silent, insidious whisper began to form, not in words, but in a torrent of pure, raw intent. Asterisk, you are part of us now. You will see. You will understand. You will feed us. Asterisk. The whisper wasn't a threat, not exactly. It was a statement of fact, chilling in its inevitability. Sarah tried to scream, to pull away, to fight against the overwhelming current, but her limbs felt like lead, her voice trapped in a throat that no longer felt like her own. Her mind was a battlefield, bombarded by images of roots like grasping tendrils, of shadows that shifted with intelligence, of eyes, so many eyes, opening in the bark of every tree, watching, waiting. The radiant depths weren't just showing her things. They were imprinting themselves upon her, searing their essence into her very soul. Just as she felt herself on the precipice of complete dissolution, on the verge of becoming nothing more than another memory within the forest's vast consciousness, a jolt, sharp and sudden, ripped her free. The blinding light receded, the cacophony faded into a dull thrumming in her ears, and the terrifying visions shattered like glass. She collapsed, gasping, onto damp earth, her body trembling violently. The air was cold, biting against her sweat-drenched skin. For a long moment she lay there, eyes squeezed shut, trying to orient herself, trying to remember who she was, where she was. The smell of pine and damp soil filled her nostrils, familiar yet now tainted with a new, unsettling depth. Slowly, carefully, Sarah pushed herself up, her muscles aching as if she'd run a marathon. Her head throbbed, a dull, insistent ache behind her eyes. When she finally opened them, the forest around her looked different. The trees were still trees, the leaves still green, but every shadow seemed deeper, every branch more gnarled, imbued with a sinister vitality she hadn't noticed before. The eye, the glowing fissure in the ancient oak, was gone. The bark was smooth, unbroken, as if nothing had ever happened. But she knew. Oh, she knew. A shudder ran through her. She reached up, touching her face, feeling the cold sweat, the frantic pulse at her temple. Her hands were shaking uncontrollably. She looked down at them, expecting to see some mark, some physical manifestation of what she had just experienced, but there was nothing. Her skin was pale, her nails grimy from the dirt, but otherwise she was unchanged. Or was she? A faint, persistent whisper, like dry leaves skittering across stone, brushed against the edges of her hearing. It wasn't loud enough to be words, but it was there, a constant, low murmur that seemed to emanate from the very air itself. She spun around, frantically searching, but saw nothing but the dense, unyielding wall of trees. "Hello," she whispered, her voice hoarse and weak. Only the rustle of leaves, or perhaps the forest's mocking reply, answered her. Panic, cold and sharp, began to claw its way up her throat. How long had she been gone? Minutes? Hours? Days? The light filtering through the canopy seemed dimmer, hinting at late afternoon, but the passage of time felt utterly meaningless, warped by the intensity of her experience. She had to get back to the others. She had to tell them. But what would she tell them? That the forest had swallowed her mind and spat her out again, filled with its ancient nightmares? She tried to retrace her steps, but the forest seemed to have shifted. Every tree looked the same. Every path vanished behind her as soon as she took a step. The oppressive sense of being watched intensified, pressing down on her from all sides. It wasn't just eyes in the bark now. It was a pervasive, almost physical presence, a collective gaze that followed her every move. Her heart pounded against her ribs. This wasn't the forest she had entered with Michael, Jessica, David, and Emily just hours, or perhaps days ago. This was something else entirely, something ancient and malevolent, something that had finally revealed its true, terrifying nature. As she stumbled forward, desperate to find a familiar landmark, a twig snapped sharply behind her. She froze, every nerve ending screaming. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice barely a tremor. Silence. Only the faint, persistent whisper continued its maddening lullaby. Then a low, guttural growl, impossibly deep and resonant, echoed from the shadows to her left. It wasn't an animal sound she recognized. It was too deliberate, too intelligent. It spoke of immense power and primal hunger. Sarah didn't wait. She broke into a run, crashing through underbrush, branches whipping at her face and arms. The growl followed, closer now, accompanied by the heavy thud of something large moving through the dense foliage. She could hear it gaining on her, a relentless pursuit that filled her with a terror far greater than any beast could inspire. This wasn't just a predator. It was an extension of the forest itself, a manifestation of its newfound awareness of her. She ran until her lungs burned, until her legs felt like jelly, until the world spun around her. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to escape the suffocating embrace of the forest that now sought to reclaim what it had momentarily released. Her mind raced, replaying fragments of the visions. The fear in those ancient faces, the consuming green, the whisper of "You will feed us." Suddenly, the ground beneath her gave way. She cried out, flinging her arms out, but it was too late. She tumbled down a steep, muddy embankment, landing hard at the bottom with a sickening crunch. Pain flared in her ankle, hot and sharp. She tried to push herself up, but a wave of nausea washed over her, and she collapsed back against the cold, damp earth. Above her on the edge of the embankment, a shadow loomed. It was massive, indistinct against the fading light, but she could feel its presence, its immense weight. The growl rumbled again, closer than ever, shaking the very ground. Sarah looked up, her vision blurry with pain and fear, and saw not one, but two glowing points of light emerge from the shadow. They were not the radiant, beckoning light of the eye she had been drawn into. These were cold, predatory, burning with a chilling intensity that promised no revelation, only oblivion. They were eyes watching her, waiting, and they were not human. The forest held its breath, and Sarah, trapped and broken at its feet, felt the full, terrifying weight of its living, breathing wrath. She had been shown its heart, and now it was coming for hers. The air grew heavy, thick with a scent she couldn't place, like damp earth, decaying leaves, and something else, something sharp and metallic like fear itself. The shadows around her deepened, not just from the setting sun, but as if the very trees were leaning in, their branches weaving a tighter cage. Sarah tried to scream, but her throat was raw, choked by the terror that seized her. Her leg throbbed, a searing reminder of her fall, but the pain was a distant echo compared to the primal dread that consumed her. From the periphery of her vision she saw movement. Not the rustling of leaves in the wind, but a deliberate, creeping advance. Shapes, indistinct at first, began to coalesce among the ancient trunks. They were tall, gaunt, and moved with an unnatural fluidity, like smoke given form. Their skin, or what looked like it, was the color of bark, mottled and rough, blending almost perfectly with the forest floor. But their eyes were not meant for human contemplation. They glowed with a faint phosphorescent light, an eerie pale green that pulsed with a cold, malevolent intelligence. They had no discernible mouths, no noses, just these two burning orbs in faces that were otherwise smooth, featureless, and utterly terrifying. There were 3 of them, she counted, though the shifting shadows made it hard to be certain. They moved in perfect, unhurried synchronicity, their silent approach more terrifying than any roar. Sarah scrambled backward, dragging her injured leg, clawing at the mossy ground. Her mind screamed for her to run, but her body betrayed her, a tangled mess of pain and paralyzing fear. Every fiber of her being urged her to escape, but the forest itself seemed to conspire against her. Roots, previously just obstacles, now felt like grasping fingers, tripping her, holding her down. The branches overhead, once just a canopy, now seemed to interlock, forming an impenetrable roof, boxing her in. One of the entities paused, its glowing eyes fixing on her. A low hum vibrated through the ground, rising from the earth itself, a sound that bypassed her ears and resonated deep in her bones. It was a sound of ancient power, of something awakening, something vast and hungry. The air around the entity shimmered, and for a horrifying moment, Sarah thought she saw the faint outline of a branch extending from its shoulder, like an organic part of its being, before retracting back into its bark-like form. This was no ordinary forest. This was a place where the veil between worlds was thin, a place where primeval forces still held sway. And she, Sarah Miller, a city girl lost and broken, had stumbled into its heart. She had broken its rules, violated its sanctity, and now it demanded payment. She remembered David's warnings, his hushed tales of strange occurrences, the unsettling sense of being watched. She had dismissed them, attributed them to his overactive imagination, his love for the macabre. How foolish she had been. David, for all his eccentricities, had been right. He had sensed it, felt the subtle shifts in the air, the unquiet whispers of the trees. He had understood in his own way that this forest was alive. Perhaps he had even seen glimpses of what now approached her. A sudden sharp crack echoed through the stillness. Not a branch breaking, but something hitting the ground nearby. Sarah flinched, her eyes darting to the source. It was her backpack, which must have tumbled free during her fall. Her mind, despite the panic, latched onto it as a desperate anchor. Inside she had a small first aid kit, a water bottle, and most importantly her phone. A phone with no signal, she knew, but a phone nonetheless. A connection to the outside world, however tenuous. A symbol of hope. The entities, however, showed no interest in the backpack. Their glowing eyes remained fixed on Sarah. They took another step forward, then another, closing the distance. The hum intensified, vibrating through her teeth. She could feel the ground beneath her tremble faintly, like a giant animal stirring from a long slumber. "Stay back," she croaked. her voice a pathetic whisper against the overwhelming silence. It was a futile gesture, an instinctual cry into the void. They didn't pause. They didn't acknowledge her words. They simply continued their relentless advance. Sarah pushed herself up, using a gnarled root for support, ignoring the searing pain in her leg. She couldn't run, not effectively, but she could try to move, to crawl, to escape their direct path. She angled herself towards the densest part of the undergrowth, hoping the thick foliage might offer some concealment, some temporary reprieve. But the forest had other plans. As she tried to push through a curtain of thorny bushes, the branches seemed to twist and interlace further, forming an impenetrable wall. She scraped her arms, drawing blood, but the thorns held firm, refusing to yield. It was as if the forest itself was actively blocking her escape, herding her towards the waiting figures. Desperation clawed at her. She was not just trapped by her injury or the wilderness. She was trapped by the conscious, malevolent will of the forest. It was a predator and she was its prey. Suddenly, a flicker of movement caught her eye, not from the entities, but from further in the trees, a deeper, darker part of the woods. It was a flash of something lighter, something that didn't quite fit the organic, earthy tones of the forest. It was brief, almost imperceptible, but it was there. A human shape? No, that was impossible. She was alone. She had to be. But the image persisted in her mind, a fleeting ghost in the periphery. Was it a trick of the light? Or was someone else out here? Someone who might help? The thought, however improbable, ignited a tiny spark of hope. The hum grew louder, more resonant, and the entities were now only yards away. She could feel the cold emanating from them, a chilling aura that seemed to drain the warmth from the air. Their glowing eyes, fixed on her, seemed to bore into her very soul, stripping away her defenses, laying bare her fear. As they drew closer, she noticed details she hadn't seen before. The bark-like skin wasn't uniform. It seemed to be woven from countless tiny tendrils, like roots intertwined, constantly shifting and subtly rearranging themselves. And from within these shifting patterns, she thought she glimpsed faint dark lines like veins, pulsing with that same eerie green light from their eyes. They were not merely creatures of the forest, they were made of it, living extensions of the trees themselves. One of them raised an arm, a slender branch-like limb that ended in no discernible hand, but rather a cluster of pointed root-like projections. It moved with a slow, deliberate grace, reaching towards her. Sarah recoiled, pressing herself against the earth, a whimpering sound escaping her lips. This was it. The end. She closed her eyes, bracing for whatever horror was about to descend upon her. Her mind raced, a torrent of regrets and unspoken words. Her parents, her sister Emily, David, she wouldn't get to say goodbye. She wouldn't get to tell them she loved them. But the touch never came. Instead, a different sound pierced the oppressive hum. A sharp metallic clang, followed by a grunt of effort. Sarah's eyes snapped open. Standing between her and the approaching entities was a figure. A human figure. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wielding a heavy-looking axe, its blade glinting dully in the fading light. He wore worn canvas pants and a thick plaid flannel shirt, his face obscured by the shadow of a wide-brimmed hat. "Get out of here!" The man's voice boomed, rough and gravelly, cutting through the eerie silence like a chainsaw through timber. He swung the axe in a wide, defensive arc, not directly at the entities, but as a clear warning. The bark-skinned figures paused, their glowing eyes now fixed on the newcomer. The hum faltered, a discordant note entering its ancient rhythm. They seemed surprised, momentarily thrown off their predatory stride. Sarah stared, disbelief warring with a surge of desperate hope. A rescuer? Here. Now. It was a miracle. But who was he? And why was he here, in this desolate, terrifying part of the woods, armed with an axe? The man took another step forward, placing himself squarely between Sarah and the entities. "I said, get out," he repeated, his voice laced with an authority that seemed to momentarily cow the forest's monstrous guardians. He didn't look back at Sarah, his gaze fixed intently on the glowing eyes of the creatures. One of the entities hissed, a sound like dry leaves skittering across stone, and shifted its weight, its branch-like arm twitching. The other two mirrored its movement, their forms rippling slightly. The hum began to rise again, growing in intensity, a clear sign of their renewed aggression. "You don't belong here, old man," one of the entities seemed to project into her mind, not through spoken words, but through a chilling telepathic pulse that made her head ache. "She belongs to us." The man chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "Belongs to no one but herself, you overgrown saplings. And I've been here longer than you've been dreaming." He tightened his grip on the axe, his stance firm and defiant. Sarah watched, mesmerized, as this unexpected protector faced down the living nightmares of the forest. He seemed unafraid, or perhaps simply too stubborn to show fear. Who was this man? And how did he know what these things were? His words, "overgrown saplings," suggested a familiarity, a history with these creatures that sent a fresh shiver down her spine. The entities, however, were not deterred for long. They had been momentarily surprised, but their ancient patience was not limitless. The hum reached a fever pitch, and the air around them crackled with an unseen energy. The trees around them seemed to sway in response, their branches groaning like ancient bones. The man braced himself, raising his axe higher. "Go on, Sarah," he yelled, finally glancing back at her, his eyes, even in the dim light, burning with fierce determination. "Run! Now!" But where could she run? The forest was alive, hostile, and seemingly everywhere. Her leg was a burning agony, yet his command, his sheer presence, injected a jolt of adrenaline into her system. She had to try. For him, if not for herself. She pushed herself to her hands and knees, ignoring the pain, and began to crawl away, her gaze still fixed on the man and the three monstrous figures. She had no idea who he was, or why he was risking his life for her. But in that moment, he was her only hope. The only thing standing between her and the living, breathing wrath of the forest. The entities lunged, not at Sarah but at the man. He met their charge with a roar, swinging his axe in a wide, powerful arc. The sound of metal meeting bark like flesh was sickening, a dull thud that resonated with raw force. One of the creatures recoiled, a faint, greenish liquid oozing from a shallow gash where the axe had connected. It didn't cry out, but its glowing eyes narrowed, burning with an intensified fury. The other two pressed their attack, moving with surprising speed. The man was skilled, agile for his apparent age, but he was outnumbered. Sarah watched in horror as he parried one root-like arm with his axe handle, then spun to avoid another, the sharp projections grazing his side, tearing a rip in his flannel shirt. "Run, Sarah!" he bellowed again, his voice strained, a clear sign of the struggle. "Don't look back." But she couldn't tear her eyes away. This man, a complete stranger, was fighting these impossible creatures because of her. She had never felt such a profound mix of gratitude and utter helplessness. Her heart pounded, a frantic drum against her ribs. She had to get away, not just for herself, but to make his sacrifice, his incredible bravery, mean something. With renewed determination, she forced her injured leg to move, dragging it across the uneven ground, pulling herself forward with her arms. Every movement sent searing pain through her, but she pushed through it, fueled by the man's desperate plea. The forest, however, continued to impede her. Low-hanging branches slapped at her face, tangled vines snaked around her good leg, threatening to trip her again. It was as if the trees themselves were reaching out, trying to hold her, to deliver her back to their monstrous guardians. She could hear the sounds of the struggle behind her, the clang of the axe, the guttural grunts of the man, the eerie hissing of the entities, and the ceaseless, resonant hum that pulsed through the very air. It was a symphony of terror, a primal battle unfolding in the heart of a living nightmare. She didn't know how long he could hold them off. She didn't know if she could even make it 10 more feet. But she had to try. She had to. She crawled deeper into the gloom, away from the immediate light of the clearing, towards what she hoped was the edge of this cursed place. The forest floor was a treacherous maze of roots and fallen leaves, each step a gamble. Her breath hitched in her chest, her lungs burning. She was utterly exhausted, physically and emotionally shattered, but the image of the man, standing defiant against the impossible, spurred her onward. She didn't know if she was moving in the right direction, or if she was simply burrowing deeper into the forest's embrace. But she kept going, driven by a desperate, animalistic instinct for survival. The sounds of the fight began to recede, fading into the background hum of the forest, replaced by the pounding of her own blood in her ears. She was alone again, but now with a faint, fragile ember of hope that had been ignited by a stranger's selfless act, and a new terrifying question. Who was he, and what was his connection to this living, breathing forest? The silence that followed David's disappearance was heavier than any sound, a vacuum that pressed in on Emily, making her eardrums ache. The forest, which moments before had thrummed with a low, insistent pulse, now seemed to hold its breath, waiting. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the sudden, unnatural stillness. The pain in her leg flared, a stark reminder of her predicament, but the image of David's eyes, the raw resolve in them, kept a fragile, flickering flame alive within her. He had saved her. He had risked everything for a stranger. Who was he? And why did he know so much about this place, about it living and breathing? Pushing herself up was agony. Her muscles screamed in protest. Her head swam with the effort. The crude bandage held but barely, already stained a deeper crimson. She couldn't stay here. The sense of dread, though momentarily dulled by the shock of David's act, began to creep back, whispering promises of renewed danger. She had to move. Not just for escape, but because that fragile ember of hope demanded action. It demanded answers. With a grunt of pain, she leveraged herself against a thick tree trunk, her vision blurring at the edges. The forest floor, once a chaotic tangle of roots and fallen leaves, now seemed to reveal a hidden order, a subtle network that David's words had unveiled. She dragged her injured leg, each step a testament to sheer will. Her focus narrowed, not on reaching a specific destination, but simply on putting one foot in front of the other, away from the immediate threat of the trap, away from the lingering scent of her own fear. As she moved, the forest began to stir again, slowly at first, like a giant awakening from a brief slumber. The low hum returned, deeper this time, vibrating not just in the air, but through the earth beneath her feet. It was a resonance, a deep organic thrum that she now recognized as the forest's slow, deliberate exhalation. The branches above swayed, not with the wind, but with an internal rhythm, a subtle, almost imperceptible undulation that spoke of immense, hidden power. The leaves rustled, a collective sigh, and she could almost swear the very air around her was thicker, humid with the forest's breath. She found herself paying attention to details she'd previously dismissed as mere flora. The bark of the trees wasn't just textured. It was intricate, like ancient, weathered skin crisscrossed with lines that resembled veins or perhaps scars. The roots, exposed above ground, didn't just sprawl. They intertwined with a deliberate, almost intelligent pattern, forming natural pathways and barriers. David's words echoed in her mind. It lives, it breathes. She was walking through a colossal, sentient organism, and the realization was both terrifying and utterly captivating. Her path led her deeper into a section of the forest she hadn't encountered before. Here, the trees were ancient giants, their trunks wider than her outstretched arms, their canopies so dense that only dappled shafts of light pierced through, illuminating patches of moss and fern with an ethereal glow. The air grew cooler, richer with the scent of damp earth and something else, something metallic and strangely sweet, like ozone after a storm. The hum intensified here, feeling less like a sound and more like a pressure against her chest, a low, resonant vibration that made the tiny hairs on her arms stand on end. It was within this cathedral of ancient growth that she saw it. A massive, gnarled oak, easily hundreds of years old, its trunk scarred and twisted. But these weren't natural scars. Deeply carved into its bark, almost integrated into its living tissue, were symbols. They weren't like any runes or pictograms she'd ever seen. They were organic, flowing lines that branched and intertwined like neural pathways, or the intricate venation of a leaf, forming complex, almost fractal patterns. They pulsed with a faint, inner light, visible only when the ambient light shifted, like embers beneath the bark. Driven by an instinct she couldn't explain, Emily limped closer, reaching out a trembling hand. Her fingertips brushed against the carved bark, cool and surprisingly smooth. The moment she made contact, a jolt, not of electricity, but of pure raw energy, surged through her arm. It was as if the tree itself had responded, a sudden, powerful thrum that resonated deep within her bones. The symbols seemed to glow brighter, pulsing in sync with her own racing heart. She pulled her hand back, startled, her breath catching in her throat. This wasn't just an old tree, it was a conduit, a focal point. Her eyes scanned the base of the massive oak, tracing the intricate root system that anchored it to the earth. There, almost completely hidden by a curtain of thick, hanging moss and the convoluted root structure, was an opening. Not a natural cave, but a deliberate cut, a dark maw leading into the earth. The air emanating from it was even cooler, carrying that same metallic sweet scent. Hesitantly, she pushed aside the moss, revealing an entrance just wide enough for her to squeeze through. The darkness beyond was absolute, but she felt a strange pull, an undeniable curiosity that overshadowed her fear. This was it, wasn't it? A clue, a piece of the puzzle that David and the forest itself had offered. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, she lowered herself into the opening, her injured leg protesting with every inch of descent. The passage was short and sloped downwards, leading into a small circular chamber. The walls were not rough earth but smooth, polished stone, veined with the same intricate, glowing pattern she'd seen on the tree outside. In the center of the chamber, illuminated by a faint phosphorescent glow emanating from the walls themselves, stood a single weathered stone altar. Upon it rested a collection of objects, intricately carved wooden figures, smooth, dark stones, and a series of thin rectangular pieces of bark, bound together with dried sinew. A journal, an ancient one. Emily hobbled towards the altar, her eyes fixated on the bark pieces. Carefully, reverently, she picked up the bundle. The bark was surprisingly resilient, almost like cured leather, and the pages were filled with delicate, flowing script, etched into the surface rather than written with ink. The language was archaic, but surprisingly legible, almost as if the forest itself had preserved it. She opened the first page, her fingers tracing the words. The entries were dated, not by conventional years, but by cycles of the forest, by phases of its breath. The author, identified only as the listener, had chronicled their life within these woods, their observations of its peculiar sentience. "Cycle of the deepening hum," she read softly, her voice barely a whisper in the silent chamber. "The forest breathes, not with lungs of flesh, but with the vast interwoven network of its roots, its mycelium, its very essence. It is a slow, deliberate respiration, drawing in the vital energies of the earth and exhaling its will upon the world. I have learned to listen to its every sigh, its every tremor. It is not merely alive, it is aware, thinks, feels, and it chooses." Emily's heart pounded. Chooses? Did it choose David? Did it choose her? She turned to another page, her eyes scanning for more answers. "Cycle of the whispering canopy. Today, I witnessed the forest's absorption again. A stag weakened by age wandered into the deep woods. The forest embraced it, not with violence, but with a gentle, inexorable pull. Its roots extended, its breath enveloped, and within hours the stag was gone, its form dissolved, its essence integrated into the greater consciousness. The forest takes what it needs and what it deems worthy. It grows stronger with each integration, its awareness expanding." A shiver ran down Emily's spine. Integration? Absorption? Was that what happened to people who disappeared in these woods? Was that what David was trying to prevent? She flipped more pages, her gaze frantic. "Cycle of the echoing heartwood. There are others who listen, others who are chosen. We are the keepers, the ones who understand its breath, who guide its will, who protect its secrets. But the forest is ancient, and its desires are not always benevolent. Seeks balance, yes, but its balance can be ruthless. It can heal, it can nurture, but it can also consume. Its breath, when focused, can mend a broken bone or shatter a mind. It is a force beyond human comprehension, a living god in bark and leaf." She turned another page, her breath catching. "The heartwood, this chamber. It is a nexus, a point where the forest's consciousness is most concentrated. Here its breath is strongest, its will most potent. To enter unprepared is to risk being overwhelmed, to have one's own essence drawn into its vast ancient mind. The forest is aware of all who approach this place, all who listen to its breath. Be warned, for when the forest truly breathes, it seeks new vessels. And it is breathing now, stronger than it has in centuries." As Emily finished reading, the phosphorescent glow in the chamber intensified, pulsing with a slow, steady rhythm that matched the hum she felt in her bones. The symbols on the walls seemed to ripple, expanding and contracting. The air grew heavy, thick with the metallic sweet scent, and the low, resonant thrumming outside the chamber grew into a deafening roar, a sound that resonated deep within her very soul. The forest was breathing, indeed, and it was no longer just aware of her. It was reaching out. The low, resonant thrumming outside the chamber grew into a deafening roar, a sound that resonated deep within her very soul. The forest was breathing, indeed, and it was no longer just aware of her. It was reaching out. The air in the ancient chamber thickened, growing heavy and charged, like the moments before a lightning strike. Emily felt it pressing in on her, a physical weight that made it hard to draw breath. The metallic sweet scent intensified, becoming almost suffocating, an intoxicating perfume that seemed to seep into her pores, settling in her lungs. Every vibration of the roar outside didn't just strike her eardrums. It vibrated through the very bones in her skull, making her teeth ache, blurring her vision. The stone walls around her seemed to shimmer, the ancient glyphs carved into their surfaces pulsing with a faint, internal light, like veins beneath skin. Panic, cold and sharp, clawed at her throat, but it was quickly overshadowed by something far more profound, a terrifying, exhilarating awe. This wasn't just a natural phenomenon, a geological oddity, or a unique biological system. This was something else entirely. This was life on a scale she had never conceived, a consciousness so vast and ancient it defied her every scientific principle. The roar wasn't just noise, it was information, a torrent of raw data and emotion that hammered against the walls of her mind. She felt a profound, primal hunger, not for food or sustenance, but for connection, for understanding. And beneath that, a deep, sorrowful loneliness, an immense solitude that had stretched across millennia. It was a cry, a whisper, a song, all woven into the deafening cacophony. She stumbled backward, her hand flying to her mouth, trying to stifle a gasp that wouldn't come. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the forest's thunderous rhythm. The chamber itself seemed to be coming alive. Fine cracks spiderwebbed across the ceiling, glowing with the same internal light as the glyphs. Dust, ancient and forgotten, rained down in shimmering motes, dancing in the charged air. Emily squeezed her eyes shut, trying to block out the overwhelming sensory assault, but it was useless. The roar was inside her, the scent was in her blood, the light was behind her eyelids. She felt a pull, an undeniable tug, not physical but something deeper, aimed at her very essence. It felt like tendrils, not of roots or vines, but of pure energy, reaching out from the vibrant, living core of the forest, seeking purchase within her own mind. She saw flashes, fragmented images that weren't her own memories. Towering trees so ancient they dwarfed mountains, their branches reaching for a sky that looked different, older. Creatures she didn't recognize, moving through primeval forests. And then a sense of immense patience, of slow, deliberate growth, of watching eons unfold like mere seconds. It was the forest's memory, its history, an unfiltered stream pouring into her consciousness. "No," she whispered, the word lost in the roar, her voice sounding alien even to herself. She fought it, tried to erect mental barriers to cling to her own identity, her own thoughts. But the forest was too vast, too powerful. It wasn't trying to harm her, not actively. It was simply being, and in its being it was overwhelming her. A new sensation arose, distinct from the roar and the pull. It was a question, an immense wordless query that filled her mind, asking, "What are you?" And then another, "Why are you here?" Emily found herself on her knees, her hands pressed against her temples, as if trying to hold her head together. Her scientific mind, usually her fortress, was crumbling under the onslaught. This wasn't a phenomenon to be studied from a distance. This was an entity demanding interaction. It wanted to know her, to understand her, in the same way she had always sought to understand it. But the scale was terrifyingly asymmetrical. She was a single cell in the presence of an entire organism. Suddenly, the roar outside began to change. It didn't diminish, but its quality shifted. The deafening, chaotic thunder began to resolve into a more structured pattern, like a complex, multi-layered chord. It was still immense, still overwhelming, but there was a distinct rhythm to it now, a deliberate pulse. And with this new rhythm, the pure hunger and loneliness she had sensed earlier were joined by something else, a fierce, protective vigilance. The internal lights within the chamber's glyphs intensified, casting long, dancing shadows. Emily looked up, her eyes wide, blurring with unshed tears, and saw that the patterns on the walls were no longer static. They were moving, flowing like liquid script, telling a story in symbols she couldn't decipher, but whose meaning she could almost feel. It was a chronicle of the forest, of its birth, its growth, its purpose. And its purpose, she realized with a chilling clarity that cut through the sensory haze, was not merely to exist. It was to guard. Guard what? She didn't know. But the sense of an ancient, sacred duty emanating from the forest was undeniable. It wasn't just breathing. It was maintaining, protecting, tending to something vital. And her presence, her intrusion into this hidden heart, had activated its deepest defenses. The metallic sweet scent, which had been so intoxicating, now sharpened, taking on an acrid, almost metallic edge. It wasn't blood, not human blood, but something richer, more fundamental. It was the scent of life force, raw and potent, being channeled, directed. The tendrils of energy she had felt earlier now seemed to solidify, to coalesce into distinct pathways within her mind, offering not just fragmented images, but coherent, though still alien, thoughts. The balance must be maintained. The thought wasn't hers, yet it was undeniably present, echoing in her skull. It was a direct communication, not through words but through pure conceptual transfer. The forest was speaking to her directly, mind to mind. Asterisk, you seek knowledge. We offer it, but knowledge comes with a price. Asterisk. Emily gasped, a real ragged breath this time. She pushed herself up, bracing her hands against the cool, vibrating stone. The glyphs on the wall closest to her seemed to glow brightest, pulling her gaze. As she stared, mesmerized, one particular symbol began to shift, to morph. It was an intricate knot, a swirling vortex. As she watched, it seemed to open, to deepen, revealing a glimpse of something beyond the solid stone. It wasn't a physical opening, not a door or a passage in the conventional sense. It was a window, a portal into another layer of reality, shimmering with an ethereal green light. Through it, she could perceive not the forest itself, but an abstract representation of its inner workings. Luminous threads of energy weaving through an infinite tapestry, vibrant nodes pulsing with life, and at the very center, a single brilliant, pulsating orb of pure, emerald light. This was it. This was the heart. This was what the forest guarded. But as she stared into the shimmering portal, another image flickered into view, superimposed over the emerald orb. It was a shadow, a fleeting angular shape that moved with a predatory grace. It was not of the forest, not organic in the way the trees were, yet it was intrinsically linked. It was a disruption, a discordant note in the forest's ancient symphony. And as the shadow solidified, taking on a form that was vaguely humanoid, elongated and gaunt, with eyes that seemed to absorb all light, the forest's protective vigilance sharpened into something akin to anger, a deep, resonant rumble that shook the very foundations of the earth. The metallic sweet scent in the chamber suddenly intensified to an unbearable degree, the air growing thick and heavy, pressing down on her. The shimmering portal on the wall pulsed violently, the emerald light within it flickering, as if struggling against an encroaching darkness. A cold dread, far deeper than any fear she had yet experienced, began to creep into Emily's chest. This wasn't merely about the forest's consciousness anymore. It was about a conflict, an ancient struggle that played out in the hidden depths of this living entity. The forest was not just breathing and reaching out, it was fighting. And the question that hammered into her mind, not from the forest, but from her own terrified intuition, was, what was it fighting against? Just as the question formed, the shimmering portal on the wall flared one last time, revealing the shadow figure in stark, terrifying clarity. It was reaching, not for the emerald orb, but for her. And in that instant, the roar outside the chamber did not diminish, but transformed, becoming a mournful warning howl, echoing with a profound sense of urgency. The forest wasn't just communicating, it was pleading. And Emily, caught between the ancient heart of the forest and the encroaching shadow, realized with a sickening lurch that she was no longer an observer. She was now undeniably, terrifyingly, a part of the struggle. A cold wave of despair, unlike anything she had ever known, washed over Emily. It wasn't her despair, not truly, but a reverberation of the forest's own profound sorrow, its ancient roots vibrating with an anguish so deep it threatened to shatter her own composure. The plea wasn't just for understanding. It was a desperate cry for action. She felt an immense, almost physical pressure, urging her, guiding her, not with words, but with a torrent of images and sensations. She saw flashes of roots tearing, of ancient stone crumbling, of a pervasive creeping darkness that seemed to leach the very color from the vibrant green around her. This wasn't merely the destruction of trees. It was the slow, agonizing demise of a living, breathing entity, a being whose existence was intrinsically tied to the balance of this entire region. The forest wanted her to do something. It was a silent, insistent command that burrowed deep into her mind, overriding her scientific objectivity, her natural skepticism. It felt like an instinct, a primal urge to protect something vital, something sacred. She knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that the shadow wasn't just a metaphor for the logging company. The company was merely a symptom, a visible wound, but beneath it thrummed something far older, far more insidious, something that had been awoken by the careless tearing of the earth. She scrambled back to her feet, her heart hammering against her ribs. The air around her felt heavy, charged with an unseen energy. The vibrant greens of the forest seemed to dim slightly, as if a veil had been pulled across the sun. She had to tell Michael. She had to tell someone. But how do you explain that a forest, an entire ecosystem, is pleading with you, showing you visions of its own slow death? How do you articulate the chilling certainty that an ancient evil is stirring, using human greed as its unwitting catalyst? When she finally found Michael back at their makeshift camp, huddled over a flickering tablet, analyzing satellite imagery, she was breathless, her eyes wide with a terror he'd never seen in her before. "Emily? What happened? You look like you've seen a ghost," he said, his brow furrowing with concern as he took in her disheveled appearance and trembling hands. "Worse, Michael. Much worse," she gasped, trying to steady her voice. "The forest, it's alive. Truly alive. It spoke to me." He slowly put down his tablet, his expression shifting from concern to a cautious perplexity. "Spoke to you? Emily, are you all right? You've been under a lot of stress, and this place, it can get to you." "No, you don't understand," she insisted, her voice rising with a desperate edge. "Not with words, not like that. But with feelings, with images, with despair. It showed me things. It's in pain, Michael. Deep, agonizing pain. And it's terrified. There's something here, something ancient, something that feeds on its life force, and the logging. It's waking it up." Michael stood up, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Emily, I believe you've had a profound experience. I know this forest is unique, and we've seen things we can't explain. But ancient evil feeding on life force? That sounds like something out of a horror movie." "It feels like a horror movie, Michael. But it's real," she countered, pulling away from his touch, frustrated by his rational skepticism. "It showed me crumbling stone, a creeping darkness. It wants me to find something, to stop something." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. Okay, let's take a breath. What exactly did it show you? Can you describe the images?" Emily closed her eyes, trying to recall the torrent of sensations. "A place. A very old place. Deep in the forest where the roots are thickest, where the earth feels thin. A place that felt like a wound." She opened her eyes, meeting his gaze with an intensity that made him pause. "And it felt like it was connected to those old stories, the ones David found about the ancients and the hollow earth or whatever. It's not just a myth, Michael. They knew something. They built something. And now it's breaking." Michael's scientific mind wrestled with the mystical pronouncements, but the genuine fear in Emily's eyes was undeniable. He had seen enough inexplicable phenomena in this forest himself to dismiss her outright. Those strange energy spikes, the unsettling silence, the peculiar way the plant life seemed to react to their presence. "All right," he said, a new seriousness entering his voice. "Let's assume for a moment that what you experienced is real. A form of profound empathic connection. Where did it direct you? Can you pinpoint it on a map, even roughly?" Emily nodded, her brow furrowed in concentration. It was a feeling more than a visual. A pull. Towards the highest point of the ridge, but not on the ridge. Somewhere beneath it almost. Where the old riverbed used to run, before the seismic shifts. Michael pulled out a detailed topographical map, spreading it on the ground. "The old riverbed, that's near the Whispering Crevice David mentioned, isn't it? The place with the unusually stable magnetic field." "Yes, that's it," Emily exclaimed, a flicker of hope igniting within her. It felt like a nexus, a place of immense power, both good and bad. If there's an ancient structure or even a natural anomaly at that location, it might explain some of the energy readings we've been getting, Michael mused, his scientific curiosity beginning to override his initial skepticism. "It's a long hike even from here. We'll need supplies, and we should probably tell David and Jessica what we're doing." A sudden chilling thought struck Emily. No, not yet. The forest, it felt like it was hiding this place, protecting it. If this shadow is as old and powerful as it feels, drawing attention to it might be dangerous. We go alone for now. Just to confirm. Michael hesitated, but the urgency in her voice, and the lingering dread he now felt in the altered atmosphere of the forest, swayed him. "Okay, just us. But we move carefully. If there's something ancient and powerful, we're not equipped to handle it. He packed a small bag with water, a first aid kit, and a more powerful flashlight. The journey to the Whispering Crevice was different this time. The forest felt heavier, the silence more profound, almost suffocating. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig seemed amplified, imbued with a sinister undertone. Emily felt the forest's constant presence, its guiding hand, but also its growing fear. It was like walking through a wound, a living entity writhing in agony. As they drew closer to the designated area, the air grew noticeably colder, even though the sun was high. The trees here were ancient, their trunks gnarled and twisted, their branches reaching like skeletal fingers towards the sky. Moss draped everything, giving the landscape an ethereal, almost mournful quality. The ground underfoot became uneven, littered with boulders and fallen logs, making their progress slow and arduous. Then Emily felt the distinct pull again, stronger this time, drawing her towards a cluster of particularly massive ivy-covered rocks. As they navigated around them, they suddenly stumbled upon an opening in the earth. It wasn't a natural cave entrance, but a clear fissure, almost perfectly rectangular, as if cut by some impossibly precise tool. It was partially obscured by dense foliage and ancient roots, but undeniably man-made, or at least shaped by something other than nature. A gust of unnaturally cold air emanated from the darkness within, carrying with it a faint metallic scent that was strangely reminiscent of ozone and something else. Something organic but utterly alien. Michael shone his powerful flashlight into the abyss. The beam struggled to penetrate the gloom, revealing only a short, steep descent into an inky blackness that seemed to swallow the light itself. This isn't natural," Michael whispered, his voice hushed with awe and a growing unease. His scientific instruments, which he'd carried almost instinctively, began to flicker erratically, their readings spiking wildly before dying completely. The air was thick with an oppressive stillness, a silence that felt less like an absence of sound and more like a presence, a heavy blanket pressing down on them. Emily felt the forest's anguish intensify, a sharp jab of fear, mixed with a desperate urgency. This was it. This was the wound. This was where the shadow resided, or at least where it was being unleashed. The ancient stones of the entrance, barely visible beneath layers of moss and earth, seemed to hum with a latent energy, a forgotten purpose. She could almost hear the echoes of the ancients, their warnings, their desperate attempt to contain whatever lay beneath. "We have to go in," Emily said, her voice barely a whisper, but laced with an unshakable resolve. "The forest, it's telling me. This is the source. We have to know what's down there." Michael looked at the flickering remains of his instruments, then back at the gaping maw of the fissure. Every instinct screamed at him to turn back, to call for help, to not venture into such an unknown, hostile place. But the look in Emily's eyes, the sheer conviction, and the palpable shift in the forest around them, told him that turning back was no longer an option. They were already too deep, too entangled. The shadow had already reached out, and now it was pulling them in. He knew with a horrifying certainty that whatever lay beyond that threshold was not merely a geological anomaly or a forgotten ruin. It was something that had been patiently waiting, and now, thanks to human intervention, it was finally ready to awaken. And they, two unwitting explorers, were about to step right into its ancient, hungry embrace. The air inside was not air at all, but a thick, humid breath that seemed to cling to their skin, tasting of damp earth, decaying leaves, and something else, something metallic and faintly sweet like sap. The tunnel they had entered was not carved rock, but a passage formed from colossal interwoven roots, slick and pulsating with a faint bioluminescent glow that shifted from emerald green to an unsettling Venus purple. It was like stepping into the trachea of some gargantuan, subterranean creature. Michael's flashlight beam, usually a sharp, cutting spear of light, seemed to diffuse and lose its potency here, absorbed by the living walls. Jessica, her hand instinctively reaching for his, felt the coarse, fibrous texture of the root walls against her fingertips, and swore she felt a tremor, a slow, rhythmic thrumming beneath the surface. It wasn't an earthquake, but something far more primal, like a heartbeat echoing from the very core of the earth. "Did you feel that?" Jessica whispered, her voice swallowed by the oppressive silence that followed. Michael nodded, his eyes wide, scanning the strange organic architecture around them. "It's breathing. The whole place." His voice was barely a murmur, laced with a fear that transcended scientific curiosity. This wasn't a discovery. It was an invasion of a sacred living space. Or perhaps they were the ones being invaded. As they moved deeper, the passage began to widen, opening into vast, cavernous chambers where the root walls soared upwards into unseen darkness. Strange, luminescent fungi pulsed in intricate patterns, casting shifting shadows that danced like phantom figures across the slick surfaces. The ground underfoot was soft, spongy, a thick carpet of moss and decaying organic matter that seemed to pull at their boots with each step. Then the whispers began. Not auditory whispers, not at first. They were subtle, a faint, almost imperceptible hum that resonated not in their ears, but directly within their minds. Like a thought forming at the edge of consciousness just out of reach. It was a sensation of immense age, of patient waiting and a burgeoning hunger. Jessica stopped abruptly, clutching her head. "Michael, do you hear that?" Michael was already swaying, his own hands pressed against his temples. "It's not a sound, Jess. It's a feeling. Like a pressure. Like something's trying to get in." He stumbled, his flashlight beam swinging wildly, briefly illuminating grotesque, root-like formations that resembled contorted faces, eternally screaming. Or perhaps they were just seeing what their minds, overwhelmed by the alien environment, wanted them to see. The air grew heavier, thick and cloying, making each breath an effort. A strange, sweet aroma, different from the earlier metallic tang, began to permeate the chamber, an intoxicating, almost narcotic scent that made their limbs feel heavy and their thoughts hazy. Suddenly, a vision exploded in Michael's mind. It wasn't a memory, nor a hallucination born of his own fear. It was a cascade of images, ancient and raw. He saw towering trees, impossibly old, their roots plunging deep into the earth, drawing sustenance from a pulsating, glowing core. He saw flashes of small, furtive creatures, deer and bears and wolves, drawn to the forest's strange allure, approaching the base of the colossal trees, their eyes wide with an unnatural calm, before their forms blurred, absorbed into the living bark, becoming one with the wood. He saw figures human-like, cloaked in primitive garb, approaching the same trees with reverence, offering sacrifices, not of blood, but of their very essence, their minds willingly merging with the vast consciousness of the forest. The feeling was not pain, but a profound, overwhelming sense of belonging, a dissolution of self into something infinite. He gasped, staggering back, the vision shattering into a million shimmering fragments. "Jessica, did you see that?" Jessica was on her knees, her face pale, eyes wide and unfocused. Tears streamed down her cheeks, not from sorrow, but from an inexplicable awe and terror. The trees. They weren't just trees. They were anchors. And the forest, it eats. It doesn't kill, Michael. It integrates. Her voice was a ragged whisper, filled with a horrified wonder. It takes everything. The light, the life, the consciousness. They were experiencing a shared psychic assault, a direct download of the entity's history and nature. The whispers intensified, coalescing into a chorus of silent voices, each one a fragment of a past life, now part of the forest's collective mind. They were not malicious but indifferent, like the slow, ceaseless grind of tectonic plates. A faint phosphorescent moss began to bloom on their clothing, tiny, glowing tendrils unfurling on the sleeves of their jackets, creeping up their boots. It wasn't just on their gear. Michael looked down at his hand and saw a faint green luminescence tracing the veins beneath his skin, pulsing with that same slow, rhythmic thrumming he'd felt in the walls. It's getting inside us," he choked out, his voice thick with rising panic. The sweet aroma was now overwhelming, making his head spin, his muscles feel slack and heavy. Every nerve ending felt alive, tingling with a strange, foreign energy. Their radios, which had been crackling sporadically, now fell completely silent, dead. Their GPS units blinked once, then went dark. The entity was not just alive. It was actively disrupting their technology, isolating them. A path illuminated by an increasingly vibrant purple glow opened before them. It wasn't a natural formation, but seemed to have grown in their presence, beckoning them deeper. A powerful magnetic pull emanated from its end, a sense of profound significance, of ultimate truth. It was the heart of the forest, the core of this living, breathing entity. They stumbled forward, their wills no longer entirely their own, drawn by an irresistible curiosity and a creeping sense of fatalism. The ground pulsed beneath them with greater intensity, the air vibrating with the silent chorus of absorbed consciousnesses. The visions returned, clearer this time, more personal. Jessica saw flashes of her own childhood, her dreams, her deepest fears, all laid bare, all offered up to the vast, indifferent entity. Michael saw his parents, his aspirations, his regrets being sifted, analyzed, absorbed. The passage opened into a vast circular chamber, its ceiling lost in the glowing purple haze. At its center was not a rock formation or an ancient altar, but a colossal, pulsating sphere of interwoven roots and bioluminescent material. It was an impossible organic heart, throbbing with an otherworldly light, radiating heat and that intoxicating, sickly sweet aroma. Thousands of glowing, thread-like tendrils extended from its surface, disappearing into the surrounding walls, into the ground, into the very air. These were the true roots of the forest, the veins that carried its lifeblood, its consciousness, its hunger. The thrumming was deafening now, not in their ears but in their bones, rattling their teeth. The green luminescence on their skin intensified, tracing intricate patterns across their faces, their hands, their exposed necks. They were no longer just observers, they were becoming conduits. As they stood before the pulsing heart, the sweet aroma intensified to an unbearable degree, and a profound, bone-deep exhaustion washed over them. Their eyelids grew heavy, their thoughts fragmented. The voices in their minds were no longer whispers, but a booming, unified chorus, echoing a single resonant thought. Welcome. You are home. You are one. Jessica felt her knees buckle, her vision blurring at the edges. She saw Michael beside her, his eyes glazed over, a strange, serene smile beginning to form on his lips. The fear that had gripped her was replaced by a profound, terrifying calm. She felt herself sinking, not into the ground, but into something far vaster, far older. The tendrils of light on her skin intensified, seeming to burrow deeper, reaching for something within her. She was not dying, she was being absorbed. And the forest, the ancient, hungry forest, was finally, completely, embracing its newest additions. The forest hummed. It was a sound deeper than any earthly vibration, a resonance that settled into the very marrow of the earth, a satisfied sigh drawn from roots that had burrowed through millennia. The tendrils of light that had consumed Jessica and Michael receded, not vanishing, but integrating back into the luminous, pulsating core of the trees themselves. The clearing, moments ago a stage for a horrifying transformation, now lay quiet, pristine, as if no human foot had ever sullied its moss-covered ground. The faint, sweet scent of ozone lingered, a ghostly echo of the strange energy that had just unfolded, quickly absorbed by the damp, earthy fragrance of the ancient woods. Days bled into a week. For Emily, Jessica's younger sister, the silence from her usually communicative sibling was not just concerning. It was a blaring alarm. Jessica and Michael had promised to check in daily from their remote cabin, a digital detox ideal that had quickly become a digital void. Emily's texts went unanswered. Her calls to Michael's phone went straight to voicemail. First she rationalized. Bad signal. Lost phone. They were enjoying their solitude. But as the days stretched, a cold dread began to coil in her stomach. Jessica never went this long without contact. Never. Finally, on the 8th day, with a knot of anxiety tightening in her chest, Emily drove the 2 hours to the small, sleepy town bordering the Blackwood Forest. The town itself was a collection of faded storefronts and houses, overshadowed by the looming dark green wall of trees that seemed to press in from all sides. The air here felt different, heavier, older. The locals she cautiously approached in the diner gave her polite but wary glances when she mentioned the Blackwood. A few muttered about the old woods and strange things, quickly changing the subject or shuffling away. Their unspoken warnings only fueled Emily's growing panic. She went straight to the local sheriff's office, a small brick building with a chipped paint sign. Sheriff Brody, a man whose face was a roadmap of sun-weathered wrinkles and whose uniform looked a size too small across his broad shoulders, listened to her story with a practiced, weary patience. He rubbed a hand over his balding head, his eyes scanning the missing persons report form Emily had filled out. "Ma'am, people come up here all the time," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Think they can rough it, get lost. We usually find them eventually, or they just decide to stay gone." There was a hint of something in his tone, a subtle inflection that suggested he knew more than he was saying, but was choosing to keep it to himself. "Jessica isn't like that," Emily insisted, her voice trembling slightly. "She's meticulous, always prepared. And Michael, he's an Eagle Scout, for crying out loud. They wouldn't just stay gone without telling anyone, especially not me." "Something's wrong, Sheriff. I can feel it." Sheriff Brody sighed, pushing himself up from his desk. "All right, Miss Hayes. We'll send a small team out tomorrow morning. See if we can locate their vehicle. But I warn you, Blackwood ain't no walk in the park. Especially this time of year." His gaze lingered on her, a flicker of genuine concern in his eyes, before he turned to pin a map of the forest on the wall. The vast, dark green expanse seemed to pulse under the fluorescent lights. The next morning, a small, grim-faced search party assembled at the edge of the forest. Sheriff Brody, along with two younger deputies, Miller and Jones, stood beside a battered Ford pickup. Emily, despite Brody's protests, insisted on joining. Her determination was a fierce, protective maternal instinct that belied her younger age. She had packed a small backpack with water and snacks, her eyes scanning the impenetrable wall of trees with a mixture of fear and desperate hope. "Stay close, Miss Hayes," Sheriff Brody instructed, handing her a two-way radio. "And don't wander off, not even for a second. This forest, it ain't like others." The unspoken words hung heavy in the crisp morning air. As they stepped beneath the canopy, the world shifted. The sunlight, moments ago bright and warm, was immediately muted, filtered through layers of ancient, impossibly tall trees. The air grew heavy, damp, carrying the scent of rich earth, decay, and something else. Something metallic like static electricity before a storm. The sounds of the outside world vanished, swallowed by the oppressive silence of the Blackwood. Even their own footsteps on the thick carpet of moss and fallen leaves seemed muffled, unreal. Deputy Miller, a fresh-faced young man barely out of the academy, pulled out his compass. He frowned, shaking it. "Sheriff, my compass is spinning like a top. And GPS is out, too." Sheriff Brody nodded grimly. "Expected that. Happens out here. Don't rely on it. Stick to the markers we put down, and keep your eyes peeled for anything." He pointed to the small, reflective tags they were tying to branches at regular intervals. Emily felt a prickle of unease crawl up her spine. The trees here were unlike any she had ever seen. Their trunks were impossibly wide, their bark a mosaic of deep greens and browns, covered in strange, luminous fungi that pulsed with a faint internal light. The branches overhead intertwined so densely that they formed a vaulted ceiling, occasionally revealing glimpses of a bruised, purple sky. There was a sense of immense, watchful age here, a feeling that they were not merely walking through trees, but through a living, breathing entity. Hours passed in a slow, arduous trek. The forest seemed to actively resist their progress. Branches snagged at their clothes, roots tripped their feet, and the paths they thought they were following seemed to subtly shift and disappear. The light grew dimmer, even though it was still mid-morning. The very air seemed to thicken, making each breath a conscious effort. Then Deputy Jones, who had been lagging slightly behind, called out, "Sheriff, over here." They pushed through a particularly dense thicket of thorny bushes and emerged into a small, overgrown clearing. There, partially obscured by towering ferns and draped in moss, was Jessica's car. A dark blue SUV, indistinguishable from hundreds of others, but Emily recognized the dent on the front bumper from a forgotten shopping cart incident. Her heart leaped into her throat, then plummeted. The car was dusty but otherwise undisturbed. No signs of forced entry, no broken windows. The doors were locked. Sheriff Brody circled it cautiously, his hand on his holstered weapon. "No struggle," he murmured. "No tracks leading away. Just gone." Emily peered through the passenger window. She could just make out a blanket folded neatly on the back seat, and a half-eaten granola bar wrapper on the dashboard. It was as if Jessica and Michael had simply vanished into thin air. Suddenly, Deputy Miller gasped, pointing to the ground near the driver's side door. "Look, Sheriff. A phone." It was Michael's phone, its screen shattered, lying face down in the moss. Emily rushed forward, her hands shaking as she picked it up. The back was scratched, the front a spiderweb of cracks. When she tried to press the power button, nothing happened. Dead. No signal, no battery, no clue. Just an empty shell. "They wouldn't have just left their car," Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. "Not like this. And Michael would never lose his phone." Her mind raced, trying to find a logical explanation, but the forest offered none. Only an eerie, unsettling silence. As they stood there, a strange, almost imperceptible shift occurred. The luminous fungi on the nearby trees seemed to pulse a little brighter, a little faster. The shadows beneath the canopy deepened, taking on a more defined, almost predatory quality. A low, resonant hum, far beneath the threshold of hearing, seemed to vibrate through the soles of Emily's boots. Deputy Jones clutched his rifle tighter. "Sheriff, I don't like this. This place, it feels wrong. Like it's watching us." Sheriff Brody, though outwardly stoic, had a subtle tension in his jaw. He looked around, his eyes narrowed, scanning the ancient trees that loomed over them. "We're not alone out here, son. But it ain't no bear or mountain lion." He knew. He'd lived in the shadow of the Blackwood Forest his whole life. He'd heard the whispers, dismissed the old wives' tales, but he'd also seen the inexplicable disappearances, the unexplainable phenomena. This wasn't just a forest. It was something else entirely. Emily felt a cold dread seep into her bones. The air grew colder, even though no breeze stirred the leaves. She felt an invisible pressure, a subtle weight pressing down on her, trying to force her deeper into the labyrinthine heart of the woods. It was a pull, an insidious invitation, wrapped in the promise of answers. "We need to keep moving," she urged, her voice brittle. "They can't be far. Maybe they just got turned around, walked away from the car." Even as she spoke the words, they sounded hollow and desperate, even to her own ears. Sheriff Brody gave her a look that was both sympathetic and deeply concerned. "Miss Hayes, if they walked away from this car, they didn't do it on their own 2 feet in the way you're thinking." He turned to his deputies. "All right, boys. We push on. Keep your eyes open and don't stray from the path. Whatever's in here, it plays games." They left the car behind, a silent sentinel in the encroaching gloom, and plunged deeper into the Blackwood. The luminous fungi seemed to grow more abundant, casting an ethereal glow on the forest floor, highlighting roots that looked like gnarled, grasping fingers. The air was thick with that strange, metallic scent, and the hum was now almost audible, a low, sustained note that resonated in Emily's teeth. Deputy Miller, trailing slightly, let out a choked cry. "Sheriff, I saw something. A light. It moved between the trees." They all stopped, turning to where Miller was pointing. Nothing. Just the endless ancient trunks, bathed in the sickly green glow of the fungi. "What kind of light, Miller?" Brody asked, his hand firmly on his pistol grip. Like a shimmer," Miller stammered, his face pale. "Like heat haze, but it moved. And it was almost iridescent. Like oil on water, but in the shape of a person." He rubbed his eyes frantically. "Or maybe I'm just seeing things. This place is messing with my head." Emily, however, felt a jolt of recognition. Iridescent light. She remembered Jessica's excited texts about the strange, shifting lights in the forest. Was this what they had seen? Was this what had taken them? The forest seemed to press closer, the trees appearing to lean in, their ancient branches forming a cage around them. The silence was no longer merely quiet. It was an active, malevolent presence, listening, waiting. The hum intensified, a vibrating current that ran through the very ground beneath their feet. It was not the sound of wind or water, but something far more primal, far more ancient. It was the sound of the forest living and breathing, and now it was breathing them in. The search for Jessica and Michael had become something far more terrifying. They were no longer the hunters. They were the hunted, unknowingly walking into the maw of an ancient, hungry entity that had just finished its last meal and was now ready for its next. The cold dread that had been a distant hum in their minds now roared to life, a primal scream echoing in the sudden, suffocating silence of the forest. The air itself seemed to thicken, heavy and cloying, pressing down on them with an invisible weight. Every rustle of leaves, every creak of ancient wood, was no longer just the sound of nature. It was a deliberate whisper, a malevolent chuckle from an unseen, all-encompassing predator. Michael felt a tremor run through him, not just from the cold, but from the horrifying realization that they had stumbled into something far beyond their understanding, a living nightmare that had been patiently waiting. Jessica, her breath catching in her throat, clutched Michael's arm, her fingers digging in like talons. Her eyes darted wildly, scanning the impenetrable wall of trees that now seemed to lean in, closer, more menacing. The lush green had taken on an almost sickly hue, a vibrant, hungry green that promised consumption. The forest floor, once just dirt and leaves, now felt like a vast, pulsating skin beneath their feet. "It knows we're here," she whispered, the words barely audible, swallowed by the oppressive silence. "It felt us." Michael could only nod, his throat tight. The scientific explanations, the logical deductions he usually relied on, had crumbled into dust. This was not a natural phenomenon. It was a conscious, predatory intelligence. He looked at the surrounding trees, their gnarled branches twisting like arthritic fingers, their trunks scarred and ancient. They weren't just trees. They were the teeth, the bones, the very fabric of this monstrous entity. They tried to move, to retrace their steps, but the path they had followed seemed to have vanished, swallowed by rapidly growing underbrush. Vines, thick as ropes, snaked across their way, seemingly appearing from nowhere, their tendrils reaching for their ankles. The ground itself felt treacherous, shifting beneath their weight, patches of moss and fungi blooming with unnatural speed, their spores filling the air with a strange, earthy sweet scent that made their heads spin. Then came the whispers, at first indistinct like the wind playing tricks through the leaves, but soon they became clearer, insidious, weaving through the fabric of their minds. Jessica heard her name, a drawn-out, mournful sound, followed by a fragment of a song her grandmother used to sing. Michael heard Emily's laughter, light and carefree, then David's booming voice, calling out coordinates, followed by a choked gasp. The sounds were distorted, warped, like recordings played through water, yet undeniably personal, designed to unravel them. "It's trying to get into our heads," Michael gritted out, squeezing Jessica's hand. "Don't listen to it. It's not real." But even as he spoke, his own mind was battling a rising tide of doubt. Was it not real? Or was this entity so powerful, so ancient, that it could pluck memories from their very consciousness and weaponize them? The air grew colder, even as the humidity intensified, a paradox that prickled their skin. The shadows deepened, twisting into grotesque shapes that seemed to lunge and recede with their peripheral vision. They pushed forward, stumbling over roots that seemed to rise intentionally, ducking under branches that swayed low, almost as if to block their escape. Every step was a battle, every breath a struggle against the thickening air. Then Michael saw it. Half buried in a patch of unusually vibrant, pulsating moss, was a glint of metal. He knelt, his heart hammering against his ribs, and pulled it free. It was David's compass, the one he had always carried, a gift from his father. But it wasn't just buried. It was fused with the moss, green tendrils weaving through the brass casing, almost as if trying to absorb it. The needle, usually static, spun wildly, then pointed straight down into the earth. And then, for a horrifying moment, the moss pulsed with a faint, internal light, a sickly green glow that seemed to emanate from within the compass itself, as if it were still connected to some living energy. "Oh God!" Jessica breathed, her hand flying to her mouth. "David!" The implication was clear, sickeningly so. The forest didn't just kill. It consumed. It assimilated. David wasn't merely gone. He was part of this place now, his essence, perhaps even his memories, absorbed into its vast, hungry consciousness. The thought was infinitely more terrifying than death. As if confirming their worst fears, the whispers intensified, coalescing into a single, droning hum that resonated deep within their bones. They heard fragments of David's distress calls, Emily's panic screams, mixed with other unknown voices, ancient murmurs that spoke of countless others who had been swallowed by the entity over centuries. It was a chorus of the lost, a symphony of assimilation. Suddenly, the ground beneath them began to heave, like a giant taking a deep breath. A massive fissure opened up directly in front of them, revealing not just dark earth, but a network of thick, pulsing roots that glowed with the same sickly green light as the compass. The air that rushed up from the chasm was foul, heavy with the scent of decay and something else, something metallic and sweet, like blood and sap. It was the smell of digested life. They scrambled back, but the ground behind them also began to ripple, roots rising like tendrils trying to ensnare them. They were trapped on a small, shrinking island of relatively stable ground, surrounded by the living maw of the forest. The trees around them swayed violently, not from wind, but from an internal tremor, their branches cracking like bones. "It's trying to pull us in," Jessica shrieked, her voice raw with terror. Michael saw a fleeting glimpse of a path to their left, a narrow gap between two particularly gnarled trees that seemed less hostile, almost inviting. It was an illusion, he knew, a trick of the forest's malevolent intelligence, but it was their only chance. "This way! We have to run!" They lunged, dodging grasping roots and swinging branches, the ground squelching beneath their feet as if protesting their escape. The whispers shrieked now, a cacophony of enraged voices, furious at their defiance. They burst through the gap, not into an escape, but into a clearing that was utterly unlike anything they had seen before. It was circular, surrounded by trees so ancient and immense they dwarfed everything else, their trunks as wide as houses, their canopies so dense they blotted out the sky, plunging the clearing into a perpetual twilight. But it wasn't the size that was terrifying. It was the central feature. In the very heart of the clearing stood a single colossal tree, different from all the others. Its bark was smooth, almost obsidian black, and it pulsed with the same faint green light they had seen in David's compass and the roots. But this tree was not merely glowing. Embedded within its trunk, like grotesque organic trophies, were objects. A rusted hunting knife, a faded backpack, a child's worn teddy bear, and most horrifyingly, a pair of hiking boots that Michael instantly recognized as Emily's, half submerged in the bark, as if the tree was slowly digesting them. And then they saw it. Not just objects. Faintly shimmering within the obsidian bark were indistinct, ghostly images. Faces contorted in silent screams or frozen in expressions of profound despair. They were the faces of the assimilated, the countless souls absorbed by this ancient horror. And among them, clearer than the rest, was a fleeting glimpse of David's tormented eyes and Emily's open mouth, forever trapped in a soundless cry. The colossal tree pulsed again, stronger this time, and a low guttural thrum vibrated through the ground, through their very bones. It wasn't just breathing, it was singing, a song of ancient hunger and endless consumption. Michael and Jessica stood frozen, their minds reeling, their hearts pounding a desperate rhythm against the overwhelming presence of the entity. They were not in a forest, they were inside a living, breathing god of consumption, and they were standing in its stomach, surrounded by the remnants of its countless meals, as it prepared to digest them too. The air, already thick with the scent of decay and damp earth, began to curdle. A low guttural thrum vibrated through the very ground beneath their feet, a sound they felt not just in their ears, but in their bones, in the marrow of their being. It was the sound of a vast biological engine preparing to ignite. The spongy, root-matted floor grew slick, glistening with a viscous, amber fluid that began to seep from the walls, from the ceiling, from everywhere. It was warm, almost comforting at first, but then a sharp, acrid sting pricked their skin. Michael recoiled, pulling his hand back, watching as the fluid sizzled faintly on his jacket sleeve. "It's acid," he rasped, his voice barely a whisper against the omnipresent thrum. "It's trying to dissolve us." Panic, cold and absolute, gripped Emily. Her eyes darted wildly. "We have to get out. We have to climb." She scrabbled at the root-laden wall, but her fingers slipped on the slick, burning mucus. Jessica, however, stood frozen, her eyes wide and unfocused, a silent scream building in her throat. The entity's presence, previously a distant hum, was now a roaring symphony within her mind, a cacophony of ancient hunger and slow, deliberate purpose. She saw flashes, not images but concepts. Vast root systems spreading beneath continents, drawing sustenance from the very core of the earth, an endless cycle of absorption and growth. It wasn't evil, it was simply being. A force of nature beyond human comprehension or morality, and it was about to consume them. David, usually cynical and guarded, felt a primal terror strip away his defenses. "This is it, isn't it? We're done. We're just food." His voice was hollow, devoid of its usual bite. He sank to his knees, staring at the rising level of the corrosive fluid. But Michael, even in the face of such overwhelming despair, refused to surrender. "No!" he shouted, his voice cracking but resolute. "We're not just food. We're not giving up." He scanned the cavernous space, his gaze sweeping over the skeletal remains, the petrified trunks, the strange, unidentifiable detritus of countless prior meals. There had to be something, a weakness, an escape. If this thing was a living organism, it had vulnerabilities. As the amber fluid began to pool around their ankles, stinging through their shoes, Michael saw it. Nestled among the bleached bones of what looked like an enormous prehistoric bird, something glinted. It wasn't metallic, not exactly. It was a shard, obsidian dark but shot through with veins of emerald light, perfectly geometric yet oddly organic looking. It pulsed with a faint internal luminescence like a trapped dying star. It hummed, a counterpoint to the entity's guttural thrum, a high, almost painful whine that seemed to resonate with Jessica's inner torment. He sloshed through the increasing depth of the corrosive fluid, ignoring the burning sensation, and snatched the shard. It was cold to the touch, impossibly smooth, and vibrated with an energy that felt both ancient and utterly alien. Jessica gasped, her eyes snapping into focus, fixed on the crystal in Michael's hand. "Give it to me," she whispered, her voice strained, as if speaking required immense effort. I can feel it. It's a key." Michael, without hesitation, handed her the crystal. The moment her fingers closed around it, her body arched, a silent scream tearing through her. Her eyes rolled back, and a torrent of images, feelings, and raw data flooded her mind, far more intense than before. She saw the entity's true form. Not just a forest, but a vast, interconnected consciousness, a sprawling network of roots and mycelium and silent, intelligent cells that extended for miles, perhaps hundreds of miles beneath the earth. It communicated through a complex bioelectrical resonance, a constant, silent chatter that sustained its immense life. This crystal, she realized, was a disruption. It was a dissonant chord in its symphony, a virus in its network. "It's not trying to kill us with malice," Jessica choked out, her voice trembling. "It's just absorbing, like breathing. This crystal, it's a disruptor. It can overload its senses, create a feedback loop." David, seeing the raw terror and desperate hope in Jessica's eyes, pushed himself up. "Overload it? How? Where do we even point it?" Emily, who had been quietly observing, her own fear momentarily overshadowed by a strange sense of clarity, pointed a shaking finger at a section of the cavern wall directly opposite them. It wasn't visually different from the rest, but to her it seemed to pulse with a slightly different intensity, a subtle shift in the overwhelming psychic pressure. "There," she whispered, her voice surprisingly steady. "That's a node, a central point. I can feel it, like a heart." Michael looked at Emily, then at Jessica, then at the throbbing crystal in her hand. "So we hit the heart with this thing and it freaks out?" Jessica nodded, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "It won't kill it. Nothing can kill something this ancient, but it might expel us, buy us time, force it to regurgitate." The idea was horrifying, but it was their only chance. The amber fluid was now waist-deep, burning through their clothes, their skin. Time was running out. "Someone has to get it there," Michael said, his gaze sweeping over the slick, root-covered walls. "And activate it. It's going to be intense." He knew it would mean exposing themselves fully to the entity's internal processes, to the full force of its psychic backlash. It could kill the person holding it. A flicker of something unexpected crossed David's face. Not fear, not despair, but a grim determination. He had always been the one to stand back, to mock, to protect himself with sarcasm. But now, seeing the raw, innocent terror in Emily's eyes, the desperate strength in Jessica, and Michael's unyielding resolve, something shifted within him. "I'll do it," he said, his voice firm, surprising even himself. "Give it to me." Michael hesitated for a fraction of a second, then nodded. "Be careful, David. It's going to be everything." Jessica, her hand still trembling, passed the crystal to David. The moment he grasped it, a jolt of pure energy shot through him, almost knocking him off his feet. He staggered but held on, his knuckles white. The crystal's hum intensified, vibrating violently in his hand. "Emily, show me the way," David yelled over the mounting thrum of the entity, his eyes fixed on the target Emily had indicated. Emily, empowered by her newfound clarity, pointed again, her arm rigid. "Straight ahead. You have to push it into the wall." With a deep, shuddering breath, David began to swim, or rather, to push his way through the viscous, acidic fluid, the crystal held aloft like a strange, glowing beacon. Every stroke was agony, every breath burned, but he kept going, propelled by a desperate, alien courage. Michael and Jessica followed, supporting Emily, who was now trembling violently, overwhelmed by the entity's rising panic. As David neared the designated node, the psychic pressure became unbearable. The entity's internal thrum rose to a deafening crescendo, reverberating directly in his skull. Tendrils thick as tree trunks began to lash out from the walls, slamming into the fluid, creating monstrous waves that threatened to drown him. The amber liquid, now a churning vortex, turned a sickening dark red. "Now, David! Now!" Jessica screamed, her voice a raw, primal sound. With a final desperate surge of adrenaline, David lunged, slamming the pulsating crystal into the root-matted wall. The effect was instantaneous and cataclysmic. A shriek, not of sound but of pure, psychic agony, ripped through the cavern. It was a scream that tore at the fabric of their minds, an unbearable symphony of pain and confusion. The entire chamber convulsed violently. The walls heaved inward, then outward. The ground bucked beneath them, and the acidic fluid erupted into geysers, stinging, burning, blinding. The crystal in David's hand flared with a blinding, emerald light, then shattered, exploding into a million shimmering motes of energy that were instantly absorbed by the writhing wall. The entity roared, a soundless psychic tempest that threatened to rip their consciousness apart. Then, with a force that defied imagination, they were expelled. It was like being shot from a cannon, compressed and then violently released. They were thrown clear through a sudden, gaping maw that had ripped open in the cavern ceiling. Propelled upwards by a surge of unimaginable pressure, the world spun, a dizzying blur of dark earth and flashing light. They landed hard, tumbling onto the forest floor, scattered like broken dolls. Michael hit a patch of soft moss, rolling several times before coming to a stop, his head throbbing. Jessica landed awkwardly against a fallen log, crying out as her arm twisted beneath her. David, having borne the brunt of the expulsion, was flung furthest, landing with a sickening thud against a tree trunk. Emily, surprisingly, landed relatively gently, her small body cushioned by a thick bed of leaves. For long moments they lay there, gasping for breath, the taste of bile and acid in their mouths, their bodies screaming in protest. The forest around them was silent, too silent. The overwhelming thrum was gone, replaced by an eerie, profound stillness. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of damp earth and something else, something ancient and disturbed. The light filtering through the canopy seemed muted, almost bruised. Slowly, painfully, Michael pushed himself up. He looked around. They were on the surface outside. The ground where they had landed was scorched, the trees bent and twisted as if by an invisible force. There was a gaping crater where the ground had been, a fresh wound in the earth, but no sign of the cavern, no visible entrance to the stomach of the beast. It had sealed itself. Jessica, her arm cradled to her chest, struggled to sit up. Her eyes, still wide with residual terror, scanned the quiet forest. "It's quiet," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "Too quiet." David groaned, pushing himself away from the tree. He felt bruised, battered, but miraculously alive. He looked at his hands, expecting to see them dissolving, but they were merely red and irritated. The crystal was gone, vanished, leaving no trace. Emily, sitting cross-legged in the leaves, looked up at the canopy, her expression a mixture of profound awe and lingering fear. "It's not gone," she said softly, her voice carrying an unsettling certainty. "It's just sleeping. Or maybe listening." They knew with a horrifying, undeniable certainty that the forest was still there. The entity, this living, breathing god of consumption, had not been defeated. It had merely been wounded, disturbed, forced to expel them. They had merely irritated a slumbering titan. They had walked into a nightmare, faced a consciousness beyond human comprehension, and by some miracle escaped. But they were not the same. They carried the scars, the memories, the chilling knowledge of what truly lurked beneath the serene green canopy. They had seen the truth. The forest lived, and it breathed, and it hungered, and it would remember. The walk out of the forest was a blur of pain and silence. They spoke little, their minds still reeling from the impossible truth. When they finally emerged, blinking into the harsh light of the real world, no one believed their story. The authorities found no evidence of a vast cavern, no acidic residue, no missing persons other than themselves. They were treated for exposure, dehydration, and psychological trauma. But Michael, Jessica, David, and Emily knew. They knew the truth. They had stood in the stomach of a god and lived to tell the tale. And every rustle of leaves, every creak of timber, every shadow in the woods would forever whisper a chilling reminder. The forest was still out there, vast and ancient, a slumbering titan waiting to awaken, to consume, to breathe once more. And they were just lucky enough to have been its temporary, indigestible meal.